Welcome back, everyone. Now we're going to discuss our second variable that we need to consider when designing a plyometric training program, and that is intensity. So the plyometric intensity is the amount of stress placed on muscles, connective tissues, and joints. It is controlled primarily by the type of plyometric drill, and generally, as intensity increases, the volume should decrease to try to prevent overtraining and or injuries. So the table 18.3 provides factors affecting the intensity of lower body plyometric drills. And there's 4 factors that you need to be aware of. The first one is the points of contact. The ground reaction force during single leg lower body plyometric drills places more stress on extremities, muscles, connective tissue, and joints than during double leg plyometric drills. So single leg are higher intensity than double leg. Number 2 is the speed. Greater speed increases the intensity of the drill. Number 3 is the height of the drill. The higher the body's center of gravity, the greater the force of landing. So anything that utilizes a box or a drop jump, anything like that, increases the intensity of the plyometric. And then lastly is body weight. The greater the athlete's body weight or mass, the more stress is placed on muscles, connective tissue, and joints. So the external weight in the form of weight vests, ankle weights, and wrist weights can be added to the body to increase a drill's intensity, but this is not recommended for a beginner. This is for someone who shows great movement proficiency with no energy leaks, and you're progressing them. They're more an advanced, classified as an advanced plyometric athlete. The third variable we need to consider is training frequency. So the typical recovery time guideline is 42 to 72 hours between plyometric sessions. This ensures proper recovery as well as it maximizes the freshness. Remember, if you have multiple training sessions within this 42 to 72 hours, then the person might not be fresh for the next session of plyometric training. Then they won't get to the maximal efforts that they need. Remember, in order to be fast and be reactive, you need to be fresh and you need to train fast. You need to overload the neuromuscular system to drive the underpinning physiological change, create the stress to drive change. If the person is fatigued and you're not allowing adequate recovery, then the person will have this monotony of training, which is moderate intensity, that they'll go through the motions of plyometrics without getting to the highest maximal intensity to drive the physiological change. So if someone is tired, then you defer plyometric training to another day when they're going to be more rested. As well, athletes commonly perform 2 to 3 plyometric sessions per week during that specific phase of training. That's the most important part. If they're in competition, the focus is competition performance. It's not on developing plyometrics. Instead, you may just maintain their plyometric ability by incorporating some small level and low volume plyometrics within the warm-up by doing the ladder drill or some jumps in place. Okay, so this is the specific phase of training will determine how frequent you're going to do plyometrics. The fourth variable that needs to be considered is recovery, and this is really the recovery between reps and sets. This is the time between sets is determined by a proper work-to-rest ratio. For plyometrics, the work-to-rest ratio is quite high. We have a 1:5 or a 1:10 based work-to-rest ratio, which means if you're doing a jump that takes 1 second, you have 5 seconds rest, or 1 second and you have 10 seconds rest. So it's 10 times, 5 to 10 times the amount of rest to work. And is specific to the volume and type of drill being performed. So recovery for depth jumps, remember depth jumps, you're using a box, and they're the highest intensity based plyometric you can do. So the rest between reps is 5 to 10 seconds. So this is between one rep. So you do a depth jump and then you rest 5 to 10 seconds. Between sets, it's 2 to 3 minutes between. Why is this so? Well, remember, plyometrics is highly demanding on the neuromuscular system, as well as it's utilizing the ATP stores and the phosphocreatine system, which takes time to replete. You need to replete phosphocreatine, and you need to create new ATP stores within the muscle. Drills should not be thought of as a cardiorespiratory conditioning exercise. Instead, this is all about power training. And some athletes do this. They think that their plyometric session will also be their cardio. And this is wrong because you're going to compromise the quality and that max force production that you could get out of your plyometric training. And so again, it comes back to this monotony of training. You're going to do everything at a moderate intensity, and you won't get to the polar extremes, that high intensity, to drive the underpinning physiological change. You need the stress to drive change. Do not think of power training or plyometrics training as cardiovascular conditioning. Drills for a given body area should not be performed 2 days in succession. So if you do lower body based plyometrics one day on Monday, maybe on Tuesday you can do some upper body. Wednesday you do trunk, and then on Thursday you go back to some lower body plyometrics, ensuring you provide adequate recovery and an adequate frequency to allow appropriate rest so the person is fresh so they can maximize the efforts. So the fifth variable that needs to be considered when we're designing a plyometric training program is volume. So for lower body drills, plyometric volume is expressed as foot contacts per workout. However, for bounding drills, it's usually distance covered. So it's recommended that lower body volumes vary for athletes with different levels of experience. So the more experience you have, the higher volume you can have. If you're a beginner at plyometrics, you're going to have a lower volume. It's all about reducing the risk of injury. So for upper body drills, plyometric volume is expressed as the number of throws or catches per workout. So this table summarizes the volume prescription or appropriate plyometric volumes based on experience. So for a beginner with no experience, the beginning volume is 80 to 100 contacts per session. For an intermediate with some experience, it's 100 to 120 contacts per session. And for an advanced, which has considerable experience, it's 120 to 140 contacts per session. I always err on the side of caution when I'm meeting someone for the first time, and I always prescribe almost an experience level less than what they could be. So if it's an advanced, sometimes for the first week, I always prescribe an intermediate volume just to ensure that we're not overloading the muscles, the tendons, the ligaments, and potentially causing injury. Now let's move into program duration. How long should a plyometric training program be? Well, it varies depending on how much time you have with your client and how important or what the priority is of plyometric-based training is for your client. Okay, so it can range from anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks, depending on the time with the client and the priority of plyometrics. Vertical jump height improves as soon as 4 weeks after the start of a plyometric training program. So the improvement is really dependent on your genetic ceiling. One, your neuromuscular development, but also your creatine, intramuscular creatine stores, and your ability to store ATP. When it comes to program progression, it's very similar to every other form of training program. And this is plyometrics is a form of resistance training and must follow the principles of progressive overload. You start at a lower level and you progress them accordingly by changing up training frequency, volume, and intensity in various combinations. You do not want to have a high frequency, a high volume, and a high intensity at once. That's a recipe for overreaching and overtraining and may lead to an injury. You want to ensure that you're manipulating volume and intensity such that when volume is high, intensity is low. When volume is low, intensity can be high. And for an elite athlete or someone who's advanced when it comes down to plyometric training, you may be able to increase volume and increase intensity at the same time without overloading the athlete. What you have to consider is the other training that your client is doing at the same time. If they're only doing plyometric training, that's one thing. But usually you do plyometric training at the same time you're doing resistance training, some cardio, and you're also training for your sport. So you have to consider frequency, volume, and intensity in light of the entire training program. One way you can incorporate plyometrics throughout the entire year is by adding some into a sport-specific warm-up. So for example, if you're in the competition season and you want to maintain all the adaptations that you acquired through your plyometric training program during that phase of training, you could just add plyos into your sport-specific warm-up. So some examples of plyometric warm-up drills are in this table. So there's marching, which mimics the running movements, emphasizes posture and movement technique. You can jog, obviously. Skipping, where your exaggerated form of reciprocal upper and lower extremity movements. You can do a lot of footwork, which I've done in the past with athletes for their warm-up, using ladder drills, shuttles, shuffles, patterns, and stride drills. And then lunging is based on the forward step exercise, maybe multi-directional, forward, side, backwards. Remember, the key here is that you have the pre-stretch and then it's followed quickly by the concentric phase. So you can do all these movements slowly, or you can do them in a plyometric fashion, which is pre-stretch followed by a very quick concentric. So this is where there's confusion, that athletes may have this in their sports-specific warm-up, but they're doing it slowly. So in this case, it's not maintaining their plyometric adaptations. Instead, you need to focus and communicate to your athlete that they need to be doing these quickly, pre-stretch followed by a quick concentric, to maintain the adaptations they acquired from their plyometric training plan. That's very important, because any exercise can be plyometric. It's just the speed of the pre-stretch followed by the concentric, where you minimize the amortization phase and you work on reactive ability. Just to summarize our key point, effective plyometric programs include the same variables that are essential to any training program, which include consideration of the mode, the intensity, the frequency, recovery and rest sets, program duration, progression, and also incorporating this stuff into your warm-ups. So now let's go over some age considerations. First, let's discuss the adolescent athlete. You need to consider both the physical and emotional maturity. The primary goal is to develop neuromuscular control and anaerobic skills that will carry over into adult athletic participation. So the key here is that you gradually progress from simple to complex. So remember, this is a young child. This is an adolescent who needs to develop and learn neuromuscular control. So you don't want to put on them complex skills where they're doing drop jumps or box-based jumps. That's not appropriate. So proficiency and technique first. So teach them how to properly pre-stretch and properly jump. Okay, this is very important. Start with the simple and then progress to more complex as they are developing their neuromuscular control and their anaerobic skills. The recovery time between workouts should be a minimum of 2 or 3 days. You do not want to overload these young athletes and cause injuries, especially since their growth plates are still forming and they can be more prone to injury. So you have to be very careful. Ensure that you're providing recovery time and you're starting with the lower intensity exercises first. I want to draw your attention back to the periods of accelerated adaptations. And this is very important when we're working with young athletes, that there are windows of time during their critical periods of development where they are more responsive to training. And this is a result of hormonal changes as well as other changes within their body, mostly hormone-based. So when we're working on speed training as well as plyometrics, max force development, all of this, we need to be mindful of the different phase or developmental age that the individual is in relative to their peak height velocity. So for females, you see that the first speed window is between the ages of 6 to 8. And then for men, it's a little bit between 7 to 9. Okay, so that's the first speed window. So you can be incorporating some plyometric-based training at that young age. But I mean, it's multiple hops. It could be hops in place, standing jumps, but you're teaching proper technique first. It's all about technique, making sure they don't have valgus, bowing knees inward, that they can land properly, especially when they're young and still developing. It's all about developing neuromuscular control so that when they hit that second speed window, for females between the ages of 11 and 13, and for men, it's a little bit later, 13 to 15, relative to their peak height velocity, PHV, that you're going to be able to train speed really well in that second window because they have neuromuscular control for which you've taught them during their first speed window. So just a few key points that I want to hammer home and make you aware of in regards to training young athletes. So under proper supervision and with an appropriate program, prepubescent and adolescent children may perform plyometric exercises. However, depth jumps and high-intensity lower body plyometrics are contraindicated for this population. That means you don't do them. They're not recommended. They actually can cause problems and damage. So there is an assigned reading in regards to plyos in kids. It's through the ACSM, so the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines, and what you should be doing in regards to plyos and young children. I highly recommend you read it because it's one of the assigned readings for this week. Now let's move into the masters athletes, which is another age consideration. The plyometric program should include no more than 5 low to moderate intensity exercises. So nothing more than that. So we're reducing the volume. The volume should be lower, should include fewer total foot contacts than a standard plyometric training program. And the recovery time between plyometric workouts should be 3 or 4 days. So the key message here is that masters athletes can do plyometric training. You just have to be smart. The volume needs to be less, the frequency has to be less, and the recovery between training sessions needs to be more. This also means double leg jumps over single leg jumps. As well, no depth jumps because that's high intensity. You ultimately want a lower intensity. Okay, so single leg is not advised. You would do double leg for this demographic, and no depth jumps and no box jumps. So now let's briefly discuss plyometric exercises in combination with resistance training. So you can combine lower body resistance training with upper body plyometrics and upper body resistance training with lower body plyometrics. The key is that you do not perform lower body heavy resistance training and lower body plyometric exercises on the same day. That's a recipe for injury and or overtraining. Some advanced athletes may benefit from complex training, which involves intense resistance training followed by a plyometric exercise. I used to do this a lot with hockey, but I was an advanced in resistance training and plyometrics, where I would do a resistance training exercise on the lower body followed by that plyometric drill right afterwards. This is not recommended for beginners, intermediates, and some advanced. Depends on their competency and their movement pattern proficiency. Here's a sample schedule for integrating resistance training and plyometrics. So on Monday, your resistance training may be high intensity upper body. The plyometrics may be lower intensity or low intensity lower body. Tuesday, we have low intensity lower body combined with high intensity upper body plyometrics. Thursday, we have low intensity upper body resistance training coupled with high intensity lower body plyometrics. And then on Friday, we have high intensity lower body resistance training coupled with low intensity upper body plyometrics. So you can see here that we're pairing together an upper body and a lower body modality, as well as we're varying the intensity between those two modalities. Remember, recall the definition of plyometrics and the goal of plyometrics. You want to ensure you're fresh and you're generating the maximum force possible, that you're focusing on minimizing the amortization phase and maximizing the force production. Another aspect to consider is the timing of plyometrics relative to other training, specifically cardiovascular exercise or aerobic exercise. Because aerobic exercise may have negative effects on power production, it is advisable to perform plyometric exercises before doing any aerobic endurance training or your cardiovascular training. Well, why? Well, what do you think? And I want you to take a minute and think about this. It really comes down to fatigue. That if you do your aerobic exercises prior to plyometrics, so you ride for 45 minutes on a bike or you go for a run, and then you want to do plyos after, one, you have substrate depletion, so you may be depleted of your substrates. You have neuromuscular fatigue. All of these result in you not necessarily getting to maximal force or creating the stress that's needed to drive a greater adaptation to plyometric training. That's why you need to be fresh when you do plyos. A warm-up, obviously, you need to do, but this isn't going to zap that much of your energy stores as well as cause too much fatigue. The problem is when you do long duration aerobic exercise prior, you're depleting your ATP stores, your phosphocreatine, your glycogen, as well as you're causing changes in hormonal balance. You're also creating more neuromuscular fatigue, which impacts the quality of the subsequent plyometric exercises. So the order is important. Now let's move into discussing the safety considerations. Before you even create a plyometric program for an athlete, you need to do a pre-training evaluation of the athlete, specifically their technique. Before adding any drill, you must demonstrate proper technique to your athlete first. So you need to become proficient in these movement patterns. Proper landing technique is essential to prevent injury and improve performance in lower body plyometrics. Okay, so you need to evaluate your athlete to ensure they know how to properly land. And that might mean developing that more neuromuscular control and awareness, spatial awareness, to prevent injuries. Let's look at an example of proper plyometric landing position. This athlete, you can see in figure A and figure B, the shoulders are in line with the knees, which helps to place the center of gravity over the body's base of support. We also see no valgus knees, so we don't see any internal rotation of the knees pointing inwards, which is very important. And we see solid foundation in the ankles. Okay, so the knees, a red flag would be that the knees are over the toes excessively. We also see excessive inward valgus movement increases the athlete's risk of lower extremity injuries. So we want to keep the knees out in line with the toes. We also want to keep the shoulders in line with the knees. And we want to prevent too much excessive knees over the toes. In line is fine, just not too much over the toes. So you need to evaluate the technique of your client before they even start plyometric training. The second safety consideration is strength, and you need to do a pre-training evaluation of the strength of your athlete. For lower body plyometrics, it was previously thought that the athlete's 1RM squat should be at least 1.5 times his or her body weight. However, more recently, information has come out that the more important consideration is technique. So if the individual has good technical skill, then they may be able to do plyometrics. But if the technical skill is not there, then you don't do plyometrics. You regress and teach proper technique first and then progress. So although an individual may be able to lift 1.5 times his or her body weight for a 1RM squat, they may do it with improper technique and movement patterns. So this is why the more important consideration is technical proficiency in regards to safety considerations, because when you're going to be doing plyos, you could result in injuries if you're not landing properly. The next safety consideration is that of balance. So in this table, we have 3 balance tests. We have a standing, double leg, single leg. We have a quarter squat, which is double leg and single leg, and a half squat for double leg and single leg. Each test position must be held for 30 seconds. Tests should be performed on the same surface used for drills. So if you're doing it on hardwood floor, then you do these balance tests on hardwood floor as well. An athlete beginning plyo training for the first time must stand on one leg for 30 seconds without falling. So how about you try that right now? Stand up from your desk, see if you can stand on one leg for 30 seconds without falling. Okay, an athlete beginning an advanced plyometric program must maintain a single leg half squat for 30 seconds without falling. Try that right now. Okay, it's pretty difficult, but that's the balance component of plyometrics. So remember, you're trying to prevent injuries and not cause injuries. So these balance tests help you assess whether the individual is more of a beginner, an intermediate, or advanced in plyometric balance and control, and will help you with your exercise prescription. Remember, if the athlete is very trained and you think that they should be an advanced plyometrics, however, their balance isn't quite there, regress them to an intermediate for a plyometric design. Okay, and then once they get their balance, once you see technical proficiency, then you can move them onwards. Emphasize a solid, stable base of support. This is very important, that these pre-training evaluation of your athlete in regards to balance is essential. So we have this table, these balance tests as reference, and to be able to classify the readiness of your athlete for plyometric training. Another safety consideration for plyometrics is the physical characteristics of your client. So athletes who have a body mass greater than 220 pounds or 100 kilograms may be at an increased risk for injury when performing plyometric exercises. Because remember, body mass increases the intensity, the strain on the muscle, the strain on the joint, the strain on the musculotendinous components. Okay, athletes weighing greater than 220 pounds or 100 kilos should not perform depth jumps from heights greater than 18 inches or 46 centimeters. That's really important in order to prevent unneeded strain on the joints and on the muscles, on the musculoskeletal system, in order to possibly cause injury. Another safety consideration is equipment and facilities, specifically the surface that the athlete is landing on. So to prevent injuries, the landing surface used for lower body plyometrics must possess adequate shock-absorbing properties. So a grass field, suspended floor, or rubber mat is a good surface choice. Another safety consideration in regards to equipment and facilities is the training area. You want to ensure that the amount of space needed is big enough, and it's really dependent on the drill that you're prescribing for plyometrics. So most bounding and running drills require greater than or equal to 30 meters or 33 yards of straightaway, though some drills may require a straightaway of 100 meters or 109 yards. So you want to ensure you have a big enough training area for what you're prescribing. For most standing, box, and depth jumps, only a minimal surface area is needed, as we know that, right? It doesn't take up that much area to be able to do that. But you need to have a ceiling height that's high enough for you to be able to do the depth jumps, to stand up on a box and not hit your head on the ceiling. So you need at least 3 to 4 meters of clearance for a ceiling height in order for you to be able to do that standing, box, and depth jumps. Another safety consideration for equipment facilities is that of the equipment itself. So boxes used for box jumps should be sturdy and should have a non-slip top. That's a non-essential. You don't want someone slipping off the top because there's not something grippy there. Boxes should range in height from 6 to 42 inches, depending on what you need. Remember, the higher the box, the higher the intensity. So you don't want high boxes for someone who's an intermediate. You progress them. It's a progressive overload to get to that height. And it really depends on the goals of your client and how much power-based training that they need. As well, boxes should have landing surfaces of at least 18 by 24 inches. This is a no-brainer, but proper footwear is essential to prevent injuries when it comes down to plyometrics. So no casual shoes. You need good ankle and foot support, good lateral stability, and a wide and non-slip sole. If people don't have that, then you don't do the plyometrics that day. Otherwise, someone may get injured. As well, supervision is a huge safety consideration. You want to closely monitor your athletes to ensure proper technique. If the person is tired or fatigued and you see that's impacting their technique, then you don't do plyometrics that day. You do not want to cause injury. You want to prevent injury, right, by doing things properly and having these proper safety considerations in place. Another safety consideration for equipment and facilities is that of depth jumping. So remember, depth jumping is the highest intensity plyometric you can have. The recommended height for depth jumps ranges from 16 to 42 inches, with 30 to 32 inches being the norm. Depth jumps for athletes who weigh greater than 220 pounds should be 18 inches or less. That's very important. Remember, body mass as well as the height of the depth jump increases intensity. So if body mass is high, you probably don't want to have that high of a depth jump to prevent injury. Also, remember, you can still get the maximum force production and train that system without doing high depth jumps. So it really comes down to keeping it basic and focusing on what you're trying to achieve, which is training the reactivity of your client to be able to minimize the amortization period and to direct that eccentric elastic energy into a maximum force production. So here is a summary of the steps for implementing a solid plyometric training program. First, you want to meet with your athlete. You do a complete history, a training history. You set some initial goals based on what they want to achieve and get out of the programming. You do a needs and demands analysis. Then you assess them and do their gap analysis, and you classify your athlete's readiness for plyometrics. Then you refine their goals based on the physical assessment and the gap analysis. So now you're saying, okay, well, based on your gaps, this is where you are, and these are some of the goals to get you where you want to be. Then the fourth thing is you teach the athlete proper jumping, landing, and throwing technique to minimize injury and optimize force production. Then you assign proper plyo programming for that individual. So the variables need to be considered: intensity, frequency, recovery volume, and program length, depending on how much time you have with the client and the priority of plyometrics for your client. And then lastly, properly progress the plyometric training program and assess their progression through routine checkpoints where you're retesting them and seeing how they're progressing. In summary, the main goal of plyometric training is firstly to develop eccentric strength. And this can be in partnership with resistance training, where you're going and working on eccentrically loading the muscle and developing that eccentric strength. And through plyometric training, you can then transfer that eccentric strength development into rapid application of force and working on minimizing that amortization phase. So plyometrics are sometimes in combination with resistance training or follow a resistance training program that's focused on eccentric strength development. Research has shown that plyometric exercise increases muscular power for participants in a formal training program. Research is yet to determine whether mechanical or the neurophysiological adaptations account for the improvement, or whether it's the combination, which is that stretch shortening cycle. After an athlete has begun a proper strength and conditioning program, plyometric training may be used to further develop power. So it's really converting the strength, the eccentric strength that's been developed through resistance training into explosive power, which is maximizing force production in a short period of time.